going to say. You set this up.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to No One Asked Us. I feel like I haven't been on the show in a while. Episode 53, and we have John Levonick back on. Second time? Third time? I'm not even sure anymore.
Let's try.
I can't keep up. But John, I wanted you on this week. I texted you saying, we've had so much news. I don't know that there's ever been a more packed news cycle around AI than last week. I don't know what you guys think, but it was just kind of bananas, in my opinion. And there was even more bananas stories coming out yesterday. So I think, the first place I want to jump in PK and John, I think, the government shut down or restricted Fable 5, right? They then allowed for, Mythos and Fable 5. They then basically said, the top, 100 companies who probably lobbied the most, you can start using Mythos again. But nobody else had access to anything. And then, I don't know, PK, what was it, like a week later or so, they released Fable 5, but they released this like horribly neutered version of Fable 5. Like, this Fable 5 is not the Fable 5 we were all playing with about a month ago. And I proved that this weekend. I mean, unless GLM is just even better than I put GLM 5.2, which is an open source model, up against Fable 5 on a couple different tests. It's not as good at coding. I'll own that one. It's not as good at fixing itself, but everything else that it did, it matched or beat Fable, in my opinion, from that perspective. So I'd love to get your guys' thoughts, like just to begin with, about, government intervening on closed source models, and, what that, the danger that kind of lurks there, right? With like the whole preferential treatment of like, oh, well, you can use this model, but you can't, sort of situation.
Well, I'd say take a step back and look at the broader picture of what's going on inside the Beltway. The GSA recently proposed a rule, it's called a GSAR, titled Basic Safeguarding of Data Within Large Language Model Artificial Intelligence Systems. This doesn't impact the audience, our world, and financial services yet. But basically, if you align the tea leaves and always look at federal procurement requirements as a precursor to broader requirements across the regulatory environment in the U.S., the government's really showing their hand here. And Andrew, along the lines of what you're talking about, I think we can kind of infer that the federal government is really starting to think about a multi-participant, multi-model use among institutions, service providers, and kind of really trying to put into four corners governance standards, which I would infer can be seen through the throttling of these commercially available frontier models. It's not a matter of there's a new reg out there, it's going to impact us. But I think if we really start to think about, concepts that are inherent in this reg, bans on commercial model training, mandatory data erasure, developer eyes-off capabilities. I think what we could see here is that there are inherent characteristics to these models that are being released so quickly that aren't going to jive with what's going to be in very short order federal rails on at least the use of multimodal LLMs in government contract fulfillment. Does that make sense or no?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think the question is like, I mean, we can take it another step further, right? Which is, I mean, you know, the government has basically told OpenAI they cannot release 5.6. So 5.6 is you know, on hold for the time being. But I heard somebody the other day, and I have a different opinion on why Sam wants to give 5% to the U.S. government, because I still question their books. Our CFO said something really funny yesterday. Apparently, Sam does not like the CFO at OpenAI, but apparently the board put her there because she's the adult in the room. And that's basically why they're not IPOing this year. At least this is the scuttlebutt. Obviously, I don't have anything confirmed on that, but the argument that somebody had for why OpenAI wants to give 5% to the government is because they want preferential treatment with their models, right? And so this then becomes the question: is, you know, well, there's 3 AI companies that the U.S. government has ownership in. Is the U.S. government going to be laxer on? Of course, right? Like, inevitably. So then you end up in this like messed up world of where everyone has to give equity to the U.S. government if they want to play on the field.
It also opens the door for the government directing the commercial entity in advance of any firm regulatory rails that take forever to get into place, right? Especially in today's marketplace. And I say it's pretext for getting direction on where the puck's going to be for the industry. So they're not spending time developing features, functionality, characteristics, intrinsically or intrinsic functionality that will be just otherwise shut down by the federal government through what's ultimately going to be some sort of federal rails on frontier models.
Also, I mean, technically, aren't they picking winners at that point? Like, based on whoever they deem, on their right side of the fence, essentially.
If they take stock, sure. But that can be seen elsewhere, like Intel and Dell and all these other things where the federal government's getting involved. So I think it aligns with this administration's efforts to have equity in large participants.
Yeah.
I thought we lived in a capitalist society. Oh,
capitalist for a few.
Okay, so I think all of this, right, should show everybody why you should not be going with a frontier model provider as your sole provider, right? Because the reality is, if you are 100% dependent on whether it's GPT or Claude, you just have no idea what the hell's going to happen. And if your application layer, and I know I'm like a broken record, PK has to listen to me way too much, at least the last several days, about open source. But I mean, PK is the one who turned me on to Hermes, and I went deep for 72 hours and was like, I'm not looking back, because now I have access to 400 models. And so it's like, if the US government shuts down Opus 4.8 tomorrow, like, okay, cool, I just swap it out. I mean, and it takes me 5 seconds, right? Sort of situation. But for these companies who've like built themselves completely on the backbone of GPT or Anthropic, like, I worry, because you just don't know what happens, right? I mean, I don't know if you guys saw the news report that came out today that the Chinese are now talking about restricting models from leaving the country, right? So like we did this, and this was the stupidity of all of it, was when we did the whole Fable can't go to foreign nationals, right? And then the other countries are like, oh, okay, fine, screw you. And it's like, what we need is the global community working on this, not a whole bunch of silos, because that's just not good for anybody, in my opinion.
Also, this might be a bit of a doomer take here, but I'm like skeptical of like these frontier labs where they're like, hey, just use our platform and use our platform for everything. And let's say you're a company, you build a lot of your tech on top of them. Um, who's like, and they eventually you've built so much of your infrastructure on one company, and then let's say 5 years later, 10 years later, they're like, actually, A, we could enter your space, or B, we're going to raise your prices. So then they're essentially like they own your like moat or your IP, and I don't know, it just kind of leaves you to like beholden to them, and like I think that's a scary place to be. Like, what if you're like they're like, hey, we're gonna raise prices, then your margins go out of whack, and then if everybody's like in a position like that, then they become kind of like the governor of all entities that are in their ecosystem, and they can just raise prices, just a tad here or there every 6 months, and next thing you know, you've got to raise prices or eat the cost. So I don't know. I think that's kind of like a dystopian take, but dystopian or doomer take. But to some degree, I feel like they can accumulate a lot of power very quickly, potentially even more power than the government, at least maybe this is an exaggeration, but like economically.
I think going all in on a frontier is just bad in the first place, and it's not practical for where we live in a heavily regulated vertical. I think that what we're looking at is going to be an ecosystem of model types. Obviously, a frontier model can't operate in the same manner that a domain tuned LLM, right, can
Right.
operate. It doesn't have the IP protections of an open source model that is embedded, for example, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't mean one is going to win and one's going to lose. I think it's going to be the quilt work or the patchwork of the various models, how they're interoperable, but also understanding strengths and weaknesses of each model, where the governance applies and how the governance applies to each model specifically based on its use and function, right? When we approach a future of AI infrastructure arrays, I guess is it for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and have you guys seen that company Thinking Machines? Apparently, they're able to fine tune models for different use cases for really cheap, and they're printing money. But I think that's an interesting thought process there too. What if you can go to them and they're like, "Hey, I want to create a model, Andrew, in your case, that is specific to querying documents or a specific type of document or tables, for example." I know you've mentioned that's one of the quirky things in our industry. So like, what if you can develop models and fine tune them and get them really like specifically fine tuned for an edge case that your business specifically covers, or my business, for example? That would
Right.
be cool. And if you can do that relatively cheap and then host it and run it across your organization, that'd be cool too. Which kind of takes us to
Well,
self-hosting.
yeah, I mean, I don't know if you saw this. So this was actually in the news this morning. It was a Tencent came out with the new High 3 open source model. Okay, so allegedly it's supposed to be right on par with GLM 5.1 and 5.2 across all the benchmarks. Now, of course, the benchmarks really don't mean that much, in my opinion. So you really need to do it. But the report said that it basically was winning in every area except for coding, right? Which is really interesting because that seems to be the thing that we continually hear about the open source models. Is like the area the furthest behind is in coding. Now, that being said, and PK laughs at me because I always vibe code income calculators for some reason. When I run tests, I had it. I had GLM code a income calculator this weekend, and in about 5 minutes, it had a pretty solid. I mean, obviously, I don't know what the backend code looked like, but the UI and the functionality, was spot on. From that perspective, the thing about High 3, and I don't know. I mean, you could probably run it on a Mac Studio in your house, quite frankly. I mean, it's half the size of GLM 5.2. I mean, the problem with GLM 5.2 is it's like 600, billion parameters or whatever. So it's just too big to run locally from that perspective. But I'm with you, PK, which is it seems to me and that there's this real big move on the enterprise side, particularly of open source, fine-tuned, on-prem solutions. Like PK sent me the latest episode of All In, which I won't watch anymore because they're so damn political. But I watched it because PK said the first 30 minutes was not political. And what? I hate politics. But I thought it was interesting that Chamath brought up the point was the cloud overhyped? And now all of a sudden there's this talk of okay, maybe cloud's not the answer for AI, which I thought was really, really interesting. And it's
back to bare metal. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah. That is what we were hearing, not in mortgage, but in other industries.
Oh wait, I saw that IBM article. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
I don't know that.
That's self-serving.
Yes, I get it. It's like Alex Karp. Well, it's like I mean, granted, I didn't understand. Everybody called Alex Karp's interview a rant, and maybe this is, I don't know. I didn't think it was a rant, quite frankly. I thought he was pretty spot on in everything that he said. Now, granted, it was self-serving. I understand that it was self-serving, but you can be, as someone said of their analysis of his interview, you can be right and self-serving at the same time.
I think people were put off by his manic ADHD presentation, which is indicative of his brilliance. And people are used to seeing.
Are you calling me brilliant? Thanks.
Of course. But I think people suspected that somebody at that level would be a little bit more polished and reserved.
No, that's why I like him.
I think what we saw as a world is that there's no secret as to why they're excelling, because that guy can do 10 million things at once and do them really well at high pace, with a level of detail that I can't even imagine. So, so I think people are caught up in the delivery, not what he said, but how he presented.
Yeah. Well, but he's the one who said several months back was that the only people who'd have jobs are neurodivergents and plumbers. And I thought it was a really interesting take. But so this is funny. I found out over the weekend from my stepmom that apparently I have a cousin who is one of the foremost neuroscientists, theoretical. I didn't even know this could be a thing. Theoretical neuroscientist and AI expert. And she is beyond, I mean, her resume, you're literally oh, I'm a monkey, talking to you, sort of situation. But she had an article in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend that was titled, AI is cannibalizing human intelligence. And what was really fascinating to me is she said 5% of humanity is excelling, will excel with AI, but the other 95% will fall behind as a result of AI. And I mean, you guys know, obviously everybody knows I'm bipolar, but for me, it as a neurodivergent, I get it, because it's so fascinating to me to watch my wife, who's, much, much smarter than me, quite frankly. And she really struggles with AI and the use of it, and she'll complain about it. And then I'm just over in the corner, John had to work with me for years, so he knows.
It allows us to see things through fruition where we would give up out of boredom halfway through previously. Yeah, and it handles the execution layer, so the neurodivergence can actually get to completion of tasks versus start stopping.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. Right, we just rolled out. John got a chance to see actually our demo of the alpha of our new product that we rolled out today. Right, that front end would have taken forever to get built, right? But we were able to vibe code the front end UI. Right now, it's went into code review yesterday, and there's components that we have to do on the back end, right, in the APIs and things like that we're not going to have, AI assisted coding doing, because it's just so complex from that perspective. But all of a sudden, it's we have this idea, we can brainstorm on it. But also you can prototype it so fast. To your point, it's like I got it to completion. Next,
You could
next.
prototype it as you crowdsource the scope, right? Of the viability and the need and the market demand. You're making changes on the fly, which is just unreal.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely incredible. But also to your point, like you can bring things to fruition like at a much more rapid rate, right? Like, I mean, you know, when Liz Short approached me about doing Ghost in the Machine, it was like I had that whole thing spun up, including post production, the website, like everything in an afternoon. And again, 4 years ago, that would have taken me, you know, days or a month, quite frankly, from that perspective. So I do think that is for someone's brain who, if your brain moves slower, which is fine, you're probably like a deep thinker, thoughtful human being, right? I think AI is more difficult for you, quite frankly.
It allows you to stress test fringe concepts very fast too, which I love. You know,
I did like what somebody said on Ghost in the Machine last week, which was it's also great for introverts because they can talk to the AI, but they don't have to talk to humans.
Yeah. Okay. I think that could lead to like psychosis. So I'm like kind of like put an asterisk on that one. I am curious though. The 5%. Your cousin that wrote the Wall Street Journal article. What's your guys' take on that 5% versus the 95% take? Do you guys agree or no?
I mean, we'll see, right? Like, it's the hard thing is that like we never know what the trade-off is, right? And I think that's the more important thing to discuss. You know, it's funny because my wife was like, "Yeah, AI is making people stupid," and I go, "How do you feel about writing?" And she was like, "What?" And I was like, "How do you feel about writing?" I'm like, "Do you think it made society better?" And she was like, "Well, yeah." And I'm like, "Well, guess what? Socrates didn't think so. Socrates thought that, I mean, it written down that like he thought writing was going to ruin humanity because they would no longer be able to memorize oral traditions." And you know what? He's right. We can't memorize oral traditions anymore, right? We introduced GPS. We can't figure out where the hell to go without a phone, right? Like these things happen, but it's always a trade-off for another thing. And the hard part, I think, for humans is that you can't really predict what that next thing is, right? Like, I don't know. We can all sit here and speculate, and I can write an article every Saturday about what the future looks like, but we're just having fun and guessing, right?
Yeah, that's fair. JVL, what do you think?
I think it allows the 5% to live where they need to live, is on the fringe of new concepts, new ideas, new content, and not be bogged down with proving and documenting. It allows for people to say, yeah, but, and continue to push the limits of thought and focus on that level of thought, and then just quickly memorialize it, document it, save it, and move on, move forward. Right. So it allows those that can live at an accelerated speed of thought and processing to maximize their ability to think and process and think about what's possible on and really push the fringe, push the parameters, push the cutting edge of thought and application without being bogged down with notes, documentation, and obviously I think the power of tooling allows for I won't say research, but proving theories very quickly through garnering evidentiary proof through research models, right? So you can live on the what if and not have to continually worry about proving the current thesis.
Yeah, that's fair. I think it's going to be as much of there is like a doomer side of me that thinks about this. I think there's overall, I think, humanity benefits, or so I believe. Um, yeah, I'm an optimist from that perspective.
The only place that I get a little bit doomer, I get a little bit nervous, is like when the government starts controlling all the models, right? Like that's what makes me like, does the next administration say that, open source models are banned or they're illegal?
You say control though. I use throttle because remember the overarching thought process coming from the Beltway is that this administration wants the U.S. to live on the cutting edge, bleeding edge of development, use, and adoption of emerging technology, right? So I would say that the federal government wants to be development partners because what's always inhibited the adoption of emerging technology is the fear that policy will arise that will derail development efforts and cost and time, right? So if policy indicators can be given to key market participants, they could streamline and focus their products, their product arrays, their offerings, their dev roadmap to align with the expectation of the standards for which they will be ultimately governed by. So I think, and I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, I think that the government involvement in this way is ultimately going to enhance and expedite the development of meaningful development and technology as it relates to U.S. related firms, right? The government doesn't want to temper U.S. firms to just have them lose out to foreign companies and lose the moniker as the best, smartest, brightest, shining city on the hill, whatever you want to call it. So I think that the role of the federal government is not to slow, but just to help define the appropriate course. And then policy rails will be deployed concurrently with the expectations that they set because, they don't want their chosen few to burn what is the most valuable resource, time, right? Money's not a slowing factor anymore, obviously, right? It's just time. And if these entities can see where the puck is going, and I know I've used that simile way too often lately, but they could spend their efforts in the most efficient manner to be the global leaders in AI and technology. That's
That's
That's an optimistic take.
there's so much optimism and
well, but
and
it comes back to like
hand in hand, but
you say like we want to be the bleeding cutting edge, right? But the reality is like we want it to be, we want to be the bleeding cutting edge as long as it's one of the 4 companies, right? Like that's what it feels like to me at this stage. The interesting thing was, I don't know if you guys have seen this interview with Mark Andreessen. I don't remember when it was. It came across my feed yesterday. John's already laughing because it's Mark Andreessen. But allegedly, this is all allegedly from out of Andreessen's mouth to God's ears, that the prior administration had said, we're gonna, basically we're gonna control these models. There's gonna be a handful of companies that have them, and that's gonna be it, and we're gonna limit it beyond that, right? This is what he said, and basically said that's why Silicon Valley all of a sudden got behind Trump, right? And now I just find the irony in it that I feel like Trump's doing a similar thing here when it comes to, whether we call it throttling or whatever. The question is again, what happens when the government now has a 5% stake in OpenAI and no stake in Anthropic, right? Like how much does Anthropic get punished, as a result of that? That's where I get concerned is like, are we really worried about being the most cutting edge, or are we really worried about, people making the most money? Like, and by people, I mean a very small group of people.
Chosen few. It's welcome to capitalism.
We should have a capitalism debate, sounds like.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I've been trying just to cut through the noise and just kind of figure out what is actually being done here, right? And I can't just stop perseverating on the fact that we are working towards a decentralized economy, and the what are the key components of success within a decentralized economy when you're talking about technology arrays, of which AI orchestration is a huge one, right? And all I keep coming back to here is that the I feel like the powers that be are forcing these capabilities into predefined functions, right? And just kind of nudging the evolution of the technology on, right? By and you know, I go back to that GSA GSAR, right? And it all comes down to governance and anticipating the various types of needs of governance as they relate to the different models, and then you think about the use cases of the models and how they can operate, you know, interoperably to create ultimately a decentralized capability, right? Because a frontier model is not end all be all, right? Each of these models have their superpowers, and I think they're starting to become resigned to the fact that, you know, no one model is going to be controlling and authoritative. It's going to allow for organizations to come to the table and link together the various types of models to get to their achieved results. And as long as we as an industry, as you know, builders in this marketplace can see that, all right, well, here are the models, here are the controls, here's what needs to be done to deploy this model type, whatever the particular use model type it be. What are the standards for governance? And I think it all comes down to governance. Maybe some regulatory compliance attorney by trade, and that's kind of how I think. But it's about creating buckets and not just giant entity silos, right? It's about creating buckets and saying, all right, here are the nuances, here how we distinguish. And ultimately, you know, I think a lot of it is it's warning corporate America not to go all in on one. You know, I think Andrew or PK, you said it earlier, right? It's dangerous. Oops. It's dangerous going all in on any one. And every organization needs to know, if when they're dealing with proprietary workflows, when they're dealing with highly sensitive data, when they're working with, you know, the various traditional business workflows, an AI can logically suit each particular use case within that workflow now, and each function has its own distinct and novel governance model. And that's where I see this GSA, you know, GSAR setting the stage. And I think that once it rolls out, what's good for the federal government, it'll be just rubber stamped for heavily regulated verticals. And obviously, you know, it's, you know, government procurement's different, but it's creating a regulatory framework for the federal government's use, which it controls exclusively, right? That can thus be broad enough to be used in healthcare, financial services, whatever the particular novel, highly regulated, sensitive, you know, business use case might be.
Two questions on that one. I think the key assumption there is that the folks in government also deeply understand this technology. You know, and so like wouldn't that matter as well?
Well, K Street understands this technology, and that's where all policy comes from, which is K Street is where all the lobbyists live, for the non-Beltway folks. And it's you know, you telling me an 83-year-old legislator is going to write meaningful policy? No. The policy is coming from the Andreessens. It's coming from the Zuckerbergs. It's coming from, you know, those that have an economic stake and economic interest.
I see.
And this plays squarely into the trade-off. You can help write policy. We'll help you write the policy, but you got to give us a seat at the table. Commercial.
Makes sense.
Which I think has the potential to eventually stifle innovation.
Well, I think it sounds like John's argument the opposite. He thinks it actually promotes innovation because now there's a clear framework on how to work around some of these.
Yeah, but who controls the keys to the fucking kingdom?
It's the traditional notion: fewer, faster, more. You know, fewer people involved, the faster it happens, and the fewer people that benefit, sure, that's a trade-off, to more encompassing, broad, slow, yeah, but nothing ever happens, right? Tale of two administrations side by side as relates to this issue, right? The last administration stepped on its own tail by having this throttled approach, and we saw the result, right? Starlink changed our election results. Who knows? That, but those that have an interest and those are given a seat, and the fewer dissenting opinions, the faster this happens and the faster to market. And I think what we're seeing is the fewer perspectives given by those that have skin in the game, and those are going to benefit the most. And the laggards will be able to keep up, on fringe cases, but they'll never compete with, the large players.
And can you also define the you said decentralized economy? Like, can you define what that actually looks like in practice?
If I could, I wouldn't be spending my time with you clowns. It means go watch RoboCop. PK, I know it's a movie that probably predates your existence, but go watch the movie RoboCop, right? If you want like a view of what the future is, it's basically, when I say decentralized, it's a fully autonomous operating ecosystem, fully autonomous operating economy, marketplace. Obviously it's going to start with marketplaces, but acting in a fully autonomous manner.
I see.
So you feel like it becomes a marketplace economy like China?
Yeah.
Doesn't it seem like we're becoming more like China and China's becoming more like us?
Yeah. Well, you won't be able to distinguish between the marketplace and the economy. It'll just be the economy. But I think that RoboCop is I think everyone should go back and kind of watch that really again.
Yeah. No.
It was dystopian in '85, but we're there. I mean, the premise, PK, is that everyone walks around with microchips. Their wallets are built into their wrists, under their skin, and they're always identified. And they're it's very Orwellian in many regards. But it's also very the controlling authorities are effectively run by a centralized knowledge.
Yep, that makes sense. I can see that happening. We kind of have some of this technology already.
Well, once again, China does, right? You can't walk down the street and, is it Japan or China? You can't walk down the street. I mean, people know where you are at a given point, right? There's facial recognition technology. You can never, there's things that are being put out into the world that we don't have control over, right? And to what extent, in a democratic republic, do we have a voice where we're concerned with privacy rights, or are we concerned with accelerating value and efficiency in marketplaces? I mean, there's a good, philosophical conversation, Andrew, for your other platform.
I was going to say, I think the privacy conversation is, we say we want privacy, but I think we always give it up for convenience.
Well, it is interesting, by the way. Have you guys seen all these reports of those flock cameras getting destroyed, all over the country? So that's the other thing, right? Like Southeast Asia, or Asia in general, I think is fairly accustomed to that. So is the Middle East, right? It's very common. Like in the UAE, for instance, I think it's the UAE. They don't have traffic cops because they just have cameras everywhere. And if you get into a car accident, it's recorded. So they know who did, they know who is at fault, sort of situation. Speeding is handled the same way. You do not speed because you will get caught, not by a cop, but by the camera, right? Sort of situation. South Korea, Japan, China, all those places have massive surveillance, but they're so accustomed to it, right? That it's they're just sort of okay.
It's happening to us already as with data privacy in the US. I think we've all come to terms with the fact that all of our sensitive data is out there and available.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, I talk about data privacy, cybersecurity to, large technology firms, and, CEOs don't want to hear about data privacy. They want to hear about the potential for being brought down and impairing their commercial, viability, not consumers' right to data privacy. And I think everyone as an industry has kind of come to terms with the fact, yeah, sure, yeah, my data is out there. You know, if you want to know my credit score or my, you know, what my social security number or my birth date, my dog's name, and you know, thanks to those, you know, questionnaires that Facebook put out many years ago, you know, I think that people are resigned to the fact that it's out there. And now the focus of cybersecurity and data privacy is more of a cybersecurity from, you know, am I gonna have a security event that's gonna brick me, and I'm not gonna be able to operate for 3 days while I have to come back online. So I think as a society, PK, to your point, we are becoming resigned to certain facts without realizing we're becoming resigned to certain facts.
That's fair. I don't know. I kind of feel like there's the genie's out the bottle. You can't really put it back in.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean we're a nation of dum-dums, right? And we, you know, we can sit here and we've got a very small audience that probably cares about anything that we have to offer. But you think about a world of people that beat their chest and say, I want data privacy and I don't want cameras on the street corner taking my biometric facial template. But then they're also the first ones on Facebook using the app to see what they look like when they're 80 years old and taking a selfie to
Yep.
see, you know, what their kids are going to look like when they age, right? And it goes exactly to like a, you know, a international database, and
Yep.
your facial template is now controlled and managed and ID'd and geo tagged and you know, mapped to your existence.
Oh yeah, there was like 1 million Chinese companies that had those things on the Apple App Store, and it was like I'm like, you know, you're so worried about putting your kids on Facebook or you know, wherever. I'm like, but you're feeding all of your data into, you know, international models, all of your photos, everything, sort of situation. All right, I want to pivot this a little bit back to, you know, the whole like, you know, I'll never forget several years ago. I was like, Sam Altman is either going to be humanity's savior, or he'll just be like an evil genius from the Minions movie. Looks like it turned out to be Minions movie. At least that's my take on it. Or sorry, Despicable Me, I guess would be the better. But it was brought up in this, in that, I think in that same conversation on All In, that, you know, Sam came out and was like, oh, we're so giving, we're going to give every founder in YC $2 million in free credits, free tokens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, yeah, because you want their ideas. Like that's the other problem I have here with like people who are like, oh, I'm just going to use a frontier model. Like, go call Accenture and see how they feel about it. I mean, Accenture fed all of their data, every single thing about their workflows, their processes, everything into OpenAI's model. And then a year or two later, OpenAI magically opens an AI-enabled consulting firm. Like
Jeff Bezos is the original architect of that. You know, AWS. You know, I had a string of like 5 years going to reInvent. And the big joke was you walk across the trade floor at AWS reInvent, their annual user conference, right, in Vegas, tens of thousands of people. And you look at all the vendors and you could say, you know, 4 out of every 5 vendors are ultimately on AWS. AWS is learning their business model, and AWS is going to provide a commercial service that then effectively replaces that independent third-party service, right? And sure as heck, you know, it'd be an interesting research project to see how many independent companies with value add solutions that sat on top of cloud computing ultimately became features of functionality within the core AWS platform, right? And I think you'd be amazed at that. So I think Altman just took a page right from Bezos's AWS playbook.
I mean, probably both of these guys, Anthropic and Altman.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. So Anthropic has now been going around, I think it was Friedberg on All In who said that Anthropic approached them about, we're building this science model, you know, we'd really love to have your data and we'll share the model with everybody. And it was like, yeah, because we're going to turn over our IP. Like, are you on drugs? Which is, you know, why that never came to fruition from that perspective. But I think it's just another thing for companies to be thinking about and recognize, which is when you're turning information over to one of these closed source frontier models, and let's be honest, it's Anthropic, it's Grok. It's OpenAI and it's Gemini. Really, at the end of the day, right? That you do
XAI.
what?
XAI.
Oh, that's Grok, isn't it? Oh, they call it XAI, whatever they call it. But Grok with a K, not a Q, just for clear. But the issue is that not only are you handing over your data, but you're tagging all your data for them, right? So it's like, I know all this data came from McKinsey, right? And I know, and now I can like structure it out, right? Like, at least if you're using like an open source or a third party application that leverages other models, like ours, for instance, we tokenize all the PII and we scramble what's sent. So you don't even know, like we only hand over the exact small amount of data that's needed in the first place, but we obscure so much off of it that like they could never figure out what the hell was going on, and how our setup is. Also, we use multiple agents throughout the process, right? So that rather than 15 steps being done by one model, we break it up all over the place so that the workflow itself doesn't end up in one single model, right? But even if it does, like, you have no idea who it even belongs to in the first place, from that perspective. So,
you threw Gemini in there, and this is my novel perspective, is that I think that Gemini's in that conversation, but they're intentionally a laggard, right? Because they're letting the folks on the front lines battle, get scarred, get killed off, learn from their mistakes, and then persevere in a tempered manner without, as a public company, without spending, an enormous amounts of money just to get slaughtered on the front lines. And, it's the concept of, first adopters are always first gone as well, or early market first gone. So I say just watch out for Gemini. Gemini is going to be the long-term winner of this, if I'm picking a horse.
If we're picking a horse, I'm picking NVIDIA and open source models. But
yeah, and you're right though. It's because at the end of the day, what it is there's no longer going to be applications and infrastructure. It's all going to be infrastructure.
Well, I think there are a couple of tells though, also, right? Like Facebook has all but basically bailed on the LLM front, right? They've already come out and said that they're suddenly. It's like, what the hell is that? They're suddenly, going to rent compute, and it was like 6 months ago that. How are you doing? Okay.
My bad.
Get under control. But 12 months ago, he said there's no way we'll ever, sell compute. And now all of a sudden, last week or a couple of weeks ago, he was like, oh yeah, we're going to sell compute. Right. And it's like, well, yeah, okay. All that tells me is you're backing off, because he's like, oh, I lost my, he learned his lesson in virtual reality, which is helping him to jump out of the CapEx wars on AI faster.
Yeah. I mean, well, and obviously, he's got obligations that the others, the newer participants, don't have yet, which is 10K and 10Q visibility into P&Ls. He could go out and say, I'm letting people go because of AI. But if you look at their quarterly reporting and their financials, it's an entirely different story, right? So private companies have the luxury of letting the narrative control. Companies like Meta have the obligation of reporting, which provides
clarity,
objective data that could counter the market, perception that they're setting, or saying, that, what Zuckerberg says publicly could be refuted in the 10Q. Doesn't matter. And at the end of the day, all that matters is investors believe, and they see a correlation between what's said and the data.
If that's the case, wouldn't these frontier companies want to delay IPO as long as possible?
Yeah. You don't want the visibility. You want the narrative to control, right? The narrative can't be contradicted with financials.
That is a very, very true statement. I still think, I always I know everybody likes to pick on Apple. but I always kind of look at Apple because I always have felt like they're, generally speaking, they're the grown up in the room, right? They've been notorious for like waiting to see what everybody else does, and then they're like, oh, that didn't work, well, we're not doing that, right? And then like when it works, they're like, oh, okay, here, we'll come in and just do it better, right? And I think it's very, everybody made fun of them 2 years ago when they weren't getting into the model business, and everybody's like, oh, this is a mistake, and I was like, God, I was probably one of them. I don't know. But now, all of a sudden, a couple of years later, it's looking like they made the smartest move, and that it's going to end up being the application layer, which we should have seen this coming, right? Because if you look at telecom is a perfect example of this, right? Which is there was so much capex dumped into telecom in the 90s, right? When the internet boom was happening, and they were like, oh, we're going to need all these lines. We're going to need all these lines. And then after the internet crash, it was something like 95% of the capacity was unused. It was crazy, right? And that like telecom became the commodity. And the application layer on the internet is what became the thing that made money, right? Fast forward, it would be like saying SQL was the money maker, right? It's not. I mean, SQL is basically the backbone of most SaaS, as old school SaaS as we sort of know it, right? Like that's not where the money is in software. And I think that's exactly what ends up happening here, which is the LLM just becomes a commodity. It's like electricity, telecom, or whatever. And the winners are actually on the application layer. And then I'll shut up. That is why I think Claude, or Anthropic in particular, has been putting so much more effort into the application layer than any of the other closed source models.
I agree. And Apple is very closely correlated to my Google argument, right? Where Apple's never been on the bleeding edge. Apple's taken from Bill Gates' playbook on making hard, easy, and consumable at scale, right? So Apple is intentionally laggard, staying close enough to once everything has been commoditized, their superpower is making something hard, easy, and accessible to the general dumb populace, right? So let the frontier, no pun intended, folks fight, figure it out, and then what will result is what is a commoditizable capability that can be delivered in a way that can be,
consumed.
Money can be made at scale to the general populace. I mean, Apple's been focused on what? Aesthetic and adoption. That's what they've been good at for years.
Sexy things.
Yeah. So they're going to make hard, sexy, and consumable at scale. And then, like I said, it'll probably be Apple and Google who will be ultimately surviving at the end of the day. And once Microsoft realizes this too, they'll be right there as well. But they got caught with their pants down in the middle and trying to be on the front edge and investing and fighting over IP and spending a lot of money on nonsensical stuff.
Well, it's sort of like, by the way, possibly the dumbest contract in the history of the world was signed yesterday.
What was that?
Anthropic signed a 20-year, $19 billion lease for a data center in Kentucky. 20 years. I mean, look at what has changed in the last 4. And you want to then extrapolate that 20 years out from now? Like, I would tell you that I have, with the speed at which we are moving in advancements right now, I have no frigging clue what the year, what 20 years from now looks like.
That's just a capital obfuscation move. That's all it is. And
Okay.
all they're doing is booking revenues and sharing revenues and reallocating revenues as income that, double, triple hitting it as income. And they're trying to manufacture value for themselves as an organization because they are fearful that they are going to be commoditized and be a cost center and not have any intrinsic value.
Okay.
And if people in Kentucky have bad water to drink, no one listens to people in Kentucky that live in the backwoods who don't have potable water, because no one's concerned with that, right? If people in Manhattan didn't have potable water, then it'd be on the front page of the newspaper, right? So great place to bury it, and it's a great place to on, once again, infrastructure. And this is where I think NVIDIA and add AMD, whoever, right, is going to come in, and they are going to be in the hardware infrastructure business. They're going to own it all.
Well, and that's why I think NVIDIA, it was so interesting to me that NVIDIA was like, well, all of a sudden comes out with an open source model. I mean, it was kind of hilarious, right? Because all of the, model providers are like, we're going to build our own chips. And I was joking with somebody that Jensen walked in the room and went, hold my beer. And then dropped a freaking, multi-billion parameter model, open source model for free, onto the internet. Right. And so I think to your point, it's like, okay, well, let's say that he gives that model to, Open Router, right? And now Open Router is going to need to buy more compute from NVIDIA or whomever, right? Like it's just the nature of the game.
They're building a utility, right? And they're entrenching their heels as a utility provider, right? And they don't have to worry about monetizing it yet. And it'll monetize itself once the rest fall by the wayside.
The thing I still come back to is, like, you guys have all seen the NVIDIA Spark, right? Yeah. Which I forget how big of a model you can put on it, but it's pretty big. I believe it's like a couple 100 billion parameter model can fit on that, right? So as with everything, let's jump out 10 years from now. And I would argue that you could run a trillion parameter model. Not that the models will be that big, right? Because again, we look at like high 5, high 3, high 3. That high 3 is half the size, right? So we're seeing the models get smaller, and we're seeing the power grow, right? But even if the size stays the same, and the power grows and the home compute grows, this is where it gets really interesting to me, and why I keep coming back to the application layer, is if I can put a model like GLM 5.2 or something that's wildly better than it, which there will be naturally, on my laptop and run my own models locally, and I'm sure, I don't know if you guys have seen, it's like floating around Instagram right now. It's probably a scam right now, but I think it's actually a good idea eventually, which is like basically like this portable box that's like you can put an AI model in it and plug it into any computer. Is basically the idea, and you instantly have a model. It's a good idea, right? Like, because if you want to switch from one place to another or whatever. Sure. But if that becomes the case, that's the even more solid argument for this going the route of the application layer really being the only thing that matters, right? And I mean, nope. I look at, and I know I'm like the biggest groupie for Hermes currently, but although we're still in debate of how it's actually pronounced. I don't know that I can call it Hermes, because then everybody will get really confused. But it's
most people don't use this.
Huh? People
who use Hermes don't use Hermes agent.
Yes, exactly.
Different.
But again, like when I look at it, it was so interesting to me working with it over the weekend, because it made me realize, oh, the only thing I actually care about is the application layer. I don't really care about the fucking model.
But also, your statement there presupposes that a single entity will consume all of that processing capability. I think we take a step back and look at what cloud computing did to compute and network. Think about it again as an infrastructure play, where now you can have potentially shared processing capabilities. It doesn't have to be dedicated to any one particular institution or entity, and you can have almost like a multi-tenant processing capability within offering.
So I know we've hit the hour. There is one more news piece that I want to drop that came out today that I thought was really interesting, which is Open Router revealed that 30% of its token usage by US companies are on open source Chinese models. 30%. That's crazy. Like, when you think about it, like that's really high. I'd be interested to see the rest of the breakdown. But that's just insane to me at 30%. And they said it actually peaked at one point at 46%.
Well, that tells you where the winds are blowing, right? It's everyone's going to have their own capability, their own controlled processing layer.
Well, and the thing, and we can have another episode about that. PK is going to drop. See you, buddy. I mean, we can have another conversation about this, another time. But one thing that nobody's talked about is what happens when fine tuning becomes much easier. Like, fine tuning is kind of difficult right now. Like, you have to put a lot of effort into it. It's not cheap to do. Like, but what happens when fine tuning becomes really, really easy, right? Because inevitably it will. Like, that's just what happens in these things, right? And like, all of a sudden you're like, oh crap.
So maybe that's maybe where we see an acceptable sentiency use of the tools.
Yeah. All right. There you go. I don't know. Maybe that can be my next company. We'll see.
There you go.
All right. Hey, Johnny, always a pleasure. I appreciate you.
Thanks for the thought-provoking conversation. You used the rest of my brain cells that I had allocated for the rest of the day, so I got to sign off for the day now.
There you go. Perfect. All right, brother. We'll talk soon.